but I'm going to record this one for the next class because I'm lucky today. I get to actually get vaccinated, which will be fun, get my first shot. It's going to be the Moderna vaccine, which is pretty exciting stuff. Okay, it took about 3 weeks to get an appointment, but we finally got one and off we go. So I'm recording this so next period can listen to it also, and also for the students at home. So my biggest class is my class at home in world history. So let's go ahead and record that. And the first thing we want to do though is to talk about the progress that's being made on getting everybody vaccinated. And what I'm going to do is just show you a short clip from the news yesterday about the United States buying 200 million more doses. So we have 600 million doses by summer. We'll probably buy some more of this Johnson & Johnson vaccine that hasn't been quite approved yet, but when it is, there'll be 100 million more there, enough to vaccinate every American, right? So that's the goal. So let's go ahead and share the screen. And it's just a short little clip, but you need to know that we're working hard in this country to get through this pandemic. Okay, so here we go. Let's just play a short clip from the news on the progress being made against the worldwide pandemic.
Tonight, a major White House push to surge vaccine doses to every state and territory, increasing by 16% the weekly vaccine supply that's sent to states, from 8.6 million doses to at least 10 million for the next 3 weeks, and giving states 3 weeks notice on how many doses they'll receive so they can adjust their distribution plans.
This can allow millions of more Americans to get vaccinated sooner than previously anticipated.
The Biden administration also buying another 200 million doses from vaccine makers Pfizer and Moderna over the summer, pushing the government's vaccine purchases to 600 million, enough to give 300 million Americans 2 shots.
It's going to take months before we can get the majority of Americans vaccinated, months.
For weeks, long lines for vaccinations have quickly dissolved into empty lots with doses running out. Millions of Americans, especially seniors, eager for vaccine protection. Many, like 79-year-old Paula Finkel in Massachusetts, still can't even get an appointment.
I'm going to try and get up at around 3 o'clock in the morning and see if I can get a reservation for my first shot.
Florida's governor says 22% of his state's 65 and older seniors have received at least 1 shot, but demand far exceeds what the federal government sends each week.
We're at the mercy of whatever is sent. So if they send 500,000 first doses instead of 266, I can double the drive-through sites. I can give more to hospitals.
In Northern Virginia, Inova Hospital's vaccination center was largely empty today after canceling plans to vaccinate 1,000 school teachers when too few doses arrived.
That's, to me, the biggest question of the day. Where are all these vaccine doses? And I think that every American citizen deserves the right to know where all these doses are.
The government says Moderna is primarily behind the effort to push more vaccine out faster. And Pfizer says with enough vaccine for a 6th dose in each vial, it can also increase vaccine supply faster, delivering its first 200 million doses before the end of June as originally promised.
Right now, we will be able to provide the 200 million doses 2 months earlier.
Meanwhile, a third vaccine maker, Johnson & Johnson, expects to request emergency FDA authorization sometime next week, a single shot that should dramatically ramp up inoculation rates.
We're very confident and on track to meet all of our commitments, which would include 100 million doses to the U.S. By the end of June.
So, Tom, bottom line is this sounds like we're talking about enough doses to cover every American this year.
Yeah, and to do that, the White House is talking about using the Defense Production Act to require companies to help with everything from vaccines to PPE to syringes, all to get more vaccines into arms.
Right. Well, that's some good news, and I think we should share that good news when we have it. Before we jump into our regularly scheduled lecture, which is, of course, going to take us back to the dawn of the modern age. Now, it's interesting that most of the companies producing the vaccine and manufacturing it to the United States, most of those are European-based companies. There's another vaccine, AstraZeneca, which is, they did the research in England at Oxford University. They're about ready to launch as well. There were 2 Turkish immigrants to Germany that figured out the Pfizer vaccine. They were the ones that came up with the formula. It's just a great history, a world history lesson that we've got so much going on. And my guess is over time, Most of this will be manufactured probably in China or India once all the production and everything else goes into kind of a stable mode, because we'll be taking vaccines for coronavirus from now till who knows how long, like we do for the modern flu. All right, well, so that's kind of important to see how the modern world can get this key word here. You ready? Supply chain. Now I'm giving you a very important word here, supply chain. How do we get a vaccine that's made, a lot of it's made in Denmark, some of it's made in Switzerland, some of it's made in the US, and there's a plant in Michigan. How do we get it all the way from wherever it's made at super cold temperatures and to get it to where it needs to be? Now, if it's just a normal product and there's no rush, it's by sea. This is really important to remember. The cheapest way to move anything is by water, because we take advantage of the buoyancy of the oceans and the rivers and so on. And we can carry much heavier loads in the water faster than any other way, but it still would take a week. Now, this stuff would be much more urgent than that. So they've retrofitted planes to be super cold, and they're flying this stuff. And so that's kind of how it's going. So there's the modern world, of course, is all about supply chain. The supply chain from the creator to the person that manufactures it, and then all the supplies. That's what they talk about, those supplies, the PPE, the needles and everything else, the syringes needed to do this. And then you have to train people at the what we call the last mile. The last mile of that supply chain is sometimes the most difficult. Get enough people who know how to take care of this vaccine at super cold temperatures, get it loaded into people's arms, and know that skill. It's a big project. This is the biggest logistical, that's what we call a supply chain. When you keep track of how a supply chains from making something to getting it to the customer, that called supply chain is called logistics. And this is the biggest logistical project that the United States or any country in the world has ever undertaken. So where did all the supply chain start? The supply chain started with those voyages I told you about of Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. Now let's take a look at a good example. The pepper that was picked up by Vasco da Gama and brought back to Spain, 2 boatloads paid for all the expenses of the country of Portugal for a year for their government. That's how valuable it was. Here, it was pennies to buy. I mean, the Indians are going, you want pepper? Okay, well, let's shake a few trees. Let's get some baskets out. Here you go. We'll load your ship up. That'll be $50. Fine. Come to Europe, sell it for thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. So the markup, it's called the markup, right? If you can get it from one place to the next where there's a high demand and people are willing to pay for it, the profits were outrageous, but you needed a supply chain. So that's why I wanted to introduce you to this vaccine issue today, is because when we talk about the modern world, what is saving our lives today is the supply chain. Look, remember early in the pandemic, we ran out of toilet paper for a while? Remember that? That was a treat, wasn't it? But that's because we overtaxed the supply chain. People rushed there, panic bought, cleared the shelves. I remember walking into the stores before we knew we needed to be wearing masks and everything. And the shelves were empty of toilet paper. Well, it took the manufacturers time to ramp up extra production in order to get that to us again in that supply chain. And some of this toilet paper may be made in Canada, maybe made in Norway, maybe made here in the States, maybe made in South America, maybe made in China. But it's all got to be shipped. And since it's a big bulky product, probably by boat is the best way to go. And then once you get it to land, rail is the next cheapest, then truck, then planes. In terms of cost, water's the cheapest, train's the next cheapest, trucks are the next cheapest, and the most expensive are planes. But this is all part of the supply chain. We just had some watermelon, for lunch today. Where did we get it from? It wasn't from the United States. It was probably from Mexico or Chile, through a supply chain that allows all the food and everything to arrive. What's been great about this pandemic is our supply chain didn't break. Many people worried about basic food supplies getting to people. Now there's a lot of people out of work that can't afford to buy food. That's a different obstacle. The food's there. We just got to make sure that they have the money to get it. And so that's supply chaining. And these countries right here, these, and add the Dutch, because they were really big with supply chain. Throw the Dutch in here, and these 5 countries changed the world. This is the world history supply chaining group of countries that made this happen. And you can also see, because they not only had ships, merchant ships, going out, grabbing these goods, bringing them back, making money, it was so profitable that the countries that supported this could afford these vast navies. And with these navies came warships with artillery on it that were really the super weapons of the day. And nobody else had them. The Europeans had the navies, and nobody else did. Japan wouldn't have a navy until the late 1860s, 1870s. Russia had a navy, but it was a European power. European does. China never had a navy during this whole 400-year period. It's only about the time of World War II that they created a navy. And I think they have about the 3rd largest navy in the world right now. We have the largest. Russia has the 2nd. And I think China has 3rd. England and Europe, combine them together, they'd be like in 4th place. But naval power is so essential because you have to protect the sea lanes. You have to protect the product. For example, one of the products coming out of the Middle East, largest exporter of oil in the world, the world's economy shuts down if those ships don't, those big tankers carrying oil don't make it all around the world. What protects them? US warships, English warships, Dutch warships, from literally pirates. You ever seen the movie? It's Captain Phillips, I think it was, Tom Hanks. True story, where they were kidnapped, hijacking off the coast of Africa, these big tankers, and holding them hostage. And it was cheaper for the companies to just pay the millions of dollars than it was to lose that cargo. But this is the kind of thing, when you're out in the open sea, you got pirate problems. And one of the cool readings that we aren't able to do this semester was Vasco da Gama and how he had to dodge the Arab pirates to get his goods back, and how that went. And of course, you know all about pirates in the Caribbean, right? Pirates of the Caribbean, you've all seen the movies. This became a real thing because those ships were really profitable. Well, how do you protect the ships? You build these big navies. If you allow pirates to disrupt the supply chain, then guess what? You don't make any profit. And your country loses its taxes, it loses its tax base, it loses its economy. So you build these big navies to defend your ships that are traveling all over the world. And while you're there, you might as well take over Australia, India, half of Africa, North America too, if you're the British. If you're the French, you're going to take half of Africa, Southeast Asia. If you're the Dutch, they're going to take over Indonesia, for example, and have colonies here. And you just take over territory where you can. That is the Western world we're talking about. And it was born out of those little ships, the caravels, and the ships of Christopher Columbus. It all started there. Then ship technology took a big leap forward. They literally started to build bigger and bigger warships. It got to the point where they had, I should get a picture, the man of war would have 40 artillery pieces on each side, all capable of just blowing an opponent to shreds. And the Dutch and the English and the French and the Spanish all created these massive navies, and they'd go to war against each other. And it was some of the most unbelievable naval battles that the world had ever seen. A new style of fighting, if you will. But let's take the merchant ship side first. Let's take the merchant ship. Right here is the ultimate in sailing speed. Because not only do you get to India, but you got to get back. And if you do it faster and can make more trips, you make more money. Simple. The ships of Vasco da Gama and of Columbus were capable of about 8 knots. This ship, its record was 22 knots. And it could carry a lot more. So look at the sails. When they got the winds right, at one point, 22 knots on a trip to Africa for this ship. It was called the Sovereign of the Sea. Here's an etching of it. This is Columbus's ship, 8 knots. The Sovereign of the Seas hit 22 knots, which is 41 kilometers an hour. That's moving. And then it was on a trip to Australia in 1854. Then you have these 11 instances of ships going 18 knots for a voyage, right? That's really fast. That's 33 miles per hour. So more than double what Columbus could do. And 10 of those, by the way, were American clipper ships. And that's what they call these, the clipper ships. All right, now, breathtaking. They would take like basically go 465 nautical miles, which is 861 kilometers in a day. Wow, on sail power alone. Of course, you know, they're going to make improvements and then go to steam engines, which are more reliable because you don't have to worry about the wind, right? And then, of course, now we have nuclear ships. That's really important that we understand how important the supply chain was that was created by these ships. Now, if you're going to have a supply chain, you're going to make it work, you got to know what time it is. You guys know all about latitude and longitude and how important it is to get the minutes and seconds and all that kind of thing in order to know where you are in those early map making. And that was all done by hand before, right? Now we have GPS, which is much more accurate. But in order to do any of this, you have to have a beginning point in time. There has to be a fixed point in time for all you Doctor Who fans. And that line, and it's a longitude coming straight down the planet, is called Greenwich Mean Time when it was created. Greenwich Mean Time is the solar time measured at the Royal Observatory in Greenwich, England. Here is actually the clock on the prime meridian that marks the beginning of time. Everything after that is time yet to happen. Everything before it is time that's already happened. Kind of sounds strange, right? We'll explain that in a second. Now, we've kind of changed this. We used to call it Greenwich Mean Time or GMT. But because, you know, that was kind of too English centric, we've made it more universal. Okay. And so now it's called Coordinated Universal Time, or UTC, a Universal Time Coordinated. You got to go backwards because it's in French and German, and never mind. But that's what it means. Coordinated Universal Time since 1972. So that's UTC. And this is the time zones about every 15 degrees around the planet where you change the time zone. You know, if you live at the beginning of the time zone, the sun sets a little sooner than when you're living at the other end of it. Time changes, and it's night in half the world and day in the other. According to Greenwich Mean Time, call this like noon, we've already gone 12 hours since day started in the middle of the Pacific, in about where Hawaii is. Morning starts there, goes 12 hours to Greenwich Mean Time, and then comes to us. Okay, so this is called the prime meridian. Here's now, why was it needed by the English Empire? Look how big their empire got. Because of their powerful navy, because of their, quite frankly, aggressiveness, and they managed to take over at one point or another all of this area you see in pink. At one time or another, the British controlled all of that, including India, where all the good stuff is. There was a company called the East India Company. And you guys have seen this, you've seen Pirates of the Caribbean. The East India Company was the wealthiest company in the world for a long, long time. Now, they were poorly mismanaged and whatever, and part of the mismanagement led to, a little thing called the Tea Party in the United States, if you know American history in Boston. But that was a mistake made by that tea company in India. It was very powerful. And they could command the British Navy at any moment to come and help them against pirates or whatever they wanted. That's why it's so fun to see Jack Sparrow running from the East India Company, because he would have been pirating their ships. And so everybody was out after Jack Sparrow. He's a fictional character, of course, but it's still a lot of fun. But it shows the power of that. Well, but if you're going to keep schedules, if you're going to figure out, okay, I'm going to load a clipper ship here, the Cutty Sark, for example, and here's how long it's expected to take to get back to England. Okay, so I've got to know when that's coming so I can have people ready to unload. I can take that, I can pre-sell product, guarantee delivery, and create a supply chain. In order to do a supply chain, you have to have every single hour accounted for across the world. Today in business, it's really important. I remember when I was working for Google here in Mountain View, and we opened up support centers in Dublin and in Hyderabad, India. The whole team now was spread across the world so that we could cover all the support calls for Google, everything that needed to be done 24/7, right? But how do you meet everybody in the team together at the same time? So we had to pick a time where it was late in the day in Mountain View. So we'd stay over till like 6 o'clock, so that then in other parts of the world, they were just getting up or just, later on in the daytime. So that was just a weird thing to figure out, to schedule, even though you were in 3 different time zones all the way around the world. Well, that's where UTC came in. I remember every company I've ever been, international company, has basically clocks on their dashboard now on your computers, but they used to put them up in the building itself to let you know what time it was in London, what time it was in Hong Kong, what time it is in Australia, so that you won't be calling somebody in the middle of the night. Or you know how to schedule your meetings or whatever. And all the scheduling software now knows all those time zones. So when you set up a meeting here in Mountain Time Zone, all of the meet people in the meeting around the world, you know what it is at their time. This is all part of the supply chain too. You can't do business unless you know what time it is everywhere in the world all at the same time. How did we get to that point? Well, there were some steps along the way. And one of the steps was a thing called the chronometer. Now, the chronometer, named after Kronos, remember Kronos, the god of time, who got conflated with Saturn? Remember the day Saturday? Okay, well, the chronometer is an instrument of measuring time designated to keep accurate time in spite of the motion and variations of temperature, humidity, air pressure on ships. The problem for Columbus is his time was an hourglass. At night, he'd be turning an hourglass over. Of course, in the daytime, when the sun was at high noon, he knew, okay, it's noon again, and he could kind of calibrate. But they were using sundial technology, okay? We had to do better than that. In order to accurately map, you've got to have it down to the minutes and seconds. And those clocks, those early clocks weren't good enough. And they're all mechanical, right? Because there's no electronic clocks at this point. So it's either use the sundial and then at night guess how much time's passed by flipping hourglasses over, or you invent something. And to show you how far advanced they were, this is a mechanical device called a chronometer that keeps accurate time to the second, despite winds, waves, movement, humidity, all that kind of stuff, in order to determine longitude. The guy that took his clock to explore the Southern Pacific was a guy by the name of Captain Cook. And Captain Cook was one of the great explorers of all time. He, of course, now had much more accurate latitude and longitude than anything Columbus or Vasco da Gama ever dreamed of. He also had the prime meridian to work with. So this is where time begins. Day starts here in the Pacific, goes here, and comes across. And so this was really important for him to explore. Now, he's famous because there were rumors that there were yet undiscovered continents in the Southern Hemisphere. Remember, the Europeans are all from the Northern Hemisphere, right? They're focusing on that. And they don't know what's going on down there. Do you realize it was well after Columbus? I mean, we're talking about a guy named Sir Francis Drake. And this wasn't until we're looking at about 1588. Before we knew there was an Antarctica, he was the first one to see it. And he only saw it in the distance. And he surmised that there might be some islands down there at the South Pole that might be worth checking out someday. They didn't even know about Antarctica until 1587, I think, was when he did that voyage. There's a lot to be discovered. And these mystery continents, right? These mystery continents hadn't been explored yet. So off he goes with a mission from England to find these. And so he does these 4 voyages. And you notice that the first thing they ran into was actually New Zealand. And so they thought, oh, that's cool. And then they're, wait a minute, whoa, time out. And it wasn't until this voyage in red, which would be the second voyage, that they managed to find this big continent of Australia. And that's why it's English speaking today, because he got there first, and so is New Zealand, and so on. Now, on one of his voyages, would be his final voyage, he would come out in this blue voyage, come down here, map all this a little bit more carefully, and then go straight up the Pacific to see what was in the center of it, because nobody had done that either. They always kind of got around the edges. He went straight up the middle and found a group of islands you might have heard about, Hawaii. He found Hawaii. And it had a little kingdom going on. There was King Kamehameha there kind of running around, uniting those islands. And you got to know them, and called these islands the Sandwich Islands, after the Earl of Sandwich. Go look at the, I should have put it in here, but go look at the Hawaii state flag. It's got the British English Union Jack in the corner where the stars and stripes are. And then it's got the stripes of the United States there. It's a beautiful flag. It's one of the prettiest flags of any state you've ever seen, but it shows that it was discovered by Captain Cook. Now, Captain Cook went on this crazy voyage up here to the Bering Sea. So he basically sailed around the world twice. He went laterally and then he went up and down. So he not only went from England and then halfway around the world to England again, but then he went up to the far North Pole from the South Pole, essentially. I mean, what a voyage, right? Finds these little islands, which are so important to the American history. And then he sails around a little bit more, comes back to Hawaii to refuel. And guess what? Gets into a fight with the natives. Second time, they weren't as excited to see them. A fight broke out and Captain Cook was caught on the beach with some of his men and he was killed. And he's buried right there on the big island of Hawaii, killed by the Hawaiians. Yeah, that's interesting history, right? So when you're on the big island, make sure you go see Captain Cook's memorial. His crew continued the voyage and continued their exploration and got back to England with all the data and all of the new places they found. Now here then is where time begins. This is the prime meridian. It goes through just outside of London, a little town called Greenwich. And since the British had the biggest empire and they were the most powerful for this time period after Spain's power had declined, they were the ones that got to call the shot. And if I'm standing on the observatory, right, looking down, here's what I see: the Thames River, and I see the Royal Academy, Maritime Academy. So this is where they train their Navy officers. And so you look right straight down here. See this line? There it is. It goes right like that, right up to the North Pole, to the South Pole. Here is the observatory itself. It's on a hill above, looking down Greenwich. Like, it's really cool. If you're in England, go to Greenwich Park, go to see the prime meridian. You can go through the old observatories where they had the old telescopes and all that kind of stuff. You can see chronometers and all that kind of sort of good thing. There's a wonderful little place off to the side. It's not very big, where you can get English tea, which means you get a bunch of desserts, okay, with your tea. It's awesome. It's great. You can do it, you know, in the afternoon. You don't have to wait till dinner. So English tea is just a lot of fun. And the clock I showed you is right over here, just behind this tree. And that's really where time starts. Also, too, they have measurements of what an actual yard and a foot and everything else is to measure against. So we have standard weights and measures. And that was another thing that they had to nail down, to make sure there's standard weights and measures. So when you buy something in one country, you know how much you've got in order to bring it back and sell it. So 100 pounds of tea, you weigh it, you know how much that's going to turn into profit and so on. Well, okay, all this is happening. Here's that clock I was telling you about. Right down here is the 2 feet. Here's your measurements right here. So any resident could go and say, oh, I got a yardstick. Let's see if it's accurate. Greenwich Mean Time. This is now solar time. It's now coordinated universal time. Okay, so pretty much got that. And the line we just showed you was the prime meridian. Okay, so I just showed you that. Okay, so we know how important then figuring out all this time is for sea travel and sea trade. What about when we get to the land? Well, when we get to the land, they were this time digging canals all over Europe, right? We dug a few canals in the United States, like the Erie Canal and so on, because then they were having mules pull barges full of goods up and down these canals. And that's very efficient, no doubt about it. But there was a guy by the name of Fisk, and he came up with a thing called the steam engine. Now, originally, the steam engine was meant to drive pumps to pull water out of mines that were filling up. And so that was its first use. But then somebody said, I bet if we put wheels on this, this would really be cool. So they created the steam engine and a locomotive. And they first started to haul, mining stuff out of mines. And some of them were really small, right? They used to use Shetland ponies for that, to pull the wagons in and out. Then they started saying, well, we can do better. But then they turned into locomotives for hauling people and products. And here is, I think, the oldest relic left of one of the first locomotives. I think that the engine here I don't know if it was covered in wood. Look how beautiful it is, but it's metal, right? And it's producing steam, and then it's moving pistons and firing this, and it can haul heavy loads. Okay, well, it can also haul people. Now, so when they started the English transportation system, the rail system, and it is brilliant. You go to any European country, the best rail systems in the world. Well, I don't know. China's putting one together that looks like it's now the best in the world. They got trains that can go 300 miles an hour. Japanese were the first to create those high speed, right? The French rail system is insanely good. Ours really is awful for passengers. It's terrible. It's third world stuff. We got a long ways to go on trains. But when it comes to trains at any time, including the Transcontinental Railroad across the United States, you've got to know when the train's going to come. So you can tell the time in the sea, but what about the time it's going to take to get the train and take it from London down to this little town, say? I've actually been there. I've actually taken the train to that little town. Okay, so it still exists. The line still exists. So there's got to be a timetable, which means this. Every single town now in England has got to be on the same time. So we need clocks in every town that are accurate, all synchronized to Greenwich. See, before this, every town could have its own time. Didn't matter. They just put a sundial out. Oh, it's noon. Hey, we'll see you around noon. Okay, cool. They had to now create watches and clocks, and they put clock towers in towns. And so everybody knew what time it was. The rail station always had this pocket watch, and you pop the pocket watch open, know exactly what time it is. This train leaves in 5 minutes. You got to keep schedules going. You can't make profits unless you can keep the schedules going. Trains that are late are unprofitable. And so now every town needed time. They needed to know what time it was in Greenwich and what their time was for when the train could pick them up and whatever. Then it started to apply toward the Industrial Revolution. What time do you show up to work? What time do you show up to school? Now, every single one of us has got to have a clock with us. We have to set alarms. We are now tied to a schedule. That is a modern invention of the modern world. They never worried about this kind of stuff in ancient times. Sundials were enough. Approximately, an hour or so, they kind of arbitrarily will meet here and have a Senate meeting in Rome. Basically, sunup was when things got started, and things slowed down when the sun went down. And sundials were pretty accurate, so they could approximate and meet up at certain times. But by the same token, now it's down to the second because of the supply chain. When you take a train, you're basically supplying a service to people and hauling things like the mail, products, this kind of stuff, and people too, and moving things around. Here is an example of Eastern Kentucky Railway. This is a special train that they're doing for a holiday period, Sunday on the Ohio River. It's kind of like a passenger service for, holiday. And here is the schedule. At 8 o'clock, it'll be here, 8:05 here, 8:20 here, 8:30 here, 8:40 here. And this is where the train's going to go. And it's going to arrive at the destination at 10. So anybody along this route can get there. And at 10 o'clock, you're going to be to where the party is. And this is the locomotive right here, one of the early locomotives here in the United States. We had these funny, it looked exactly like one of the trains that was used when they did the Golden Spike, when they did the Transcontinental Railroad from the East Coast to the West Coast, and it met up here in Utah. And this would have looked just like the locomotive that came out of California. Anyway, now today, let's get more to the modern world at this moment. All over the world too, there's a huge financial industry. How do you pay for the supply chain? How do you buy products? How do you sell products? Look at Pfizer, look at Moderna. They're making billions of dollars on this vaccine. These vaccines are not free. We are paying a lot of money, so much money that half the people in America could not afford to buy their own vaccine. If we as taxpayers don't pool our money and vaccinate our neighbors who might not have as much money as we do, then we get sick. So it's all in our best interest to do this as a team. All right, then. So you're Pfizer and Moderna, and you're on a foreign exchange. You're a business that's making money, and you have stock, and you have shareholders. This is also an invention of the modern world. The idea of stock and shareholders and all this kind of stuff. Corporations is a modern invention. It actually has some roots in Roman history, but basically it was invented in Italy, in modern times. Now, all over the world, then there's these stock exchanges. And this is where companies' shares and stock trades happen rapidly all day. But now here's the thing. Stock trading starts in the morning in Japan, China, and Hong Kong. Those early signals tell us what the markets are doing around the world. By the time it gets to Europe, crazy things can happen. Like in this last pandemic, when it first started to hit, how bad it was, stock markets all over Asia started to drop. By the time it got to Europe, it was flying down. And then when it got to the United States later in the day, bam, we had some problems. We lost trillions of dollars in just one day because of a stock panic. But then by the same token, you can get some good news in the morning in Asia, some good news in Europe, and it'll be good news for us in the afternoon. So this is important to know the times. And there's literally people that are assigned to stay awake all night just to advise the people coming into work in the morning in New York what's happened. But at any rate, let's take a look now of what this global trade and supply chain has created. Businesses that are making lots of money and trading it on stock exchanges. Now, what you see here, and I apologize for the graininess of the photo because it's the best I could do. Here's a map of the world, and these little bubbles are the major stock trading centers and their relative value. You notice the biggest one? It's still New York City. It's the New York Stock Exchange. Here's the Chicago Mercantile. Here's the Canadian Stock Exchange. Look at these 5 big ones in Europe, but look at these growing ones in Asia. We might not be too far away from this now being smaller. It's still going to grow. It's still going to get bigger. It's not going to shrink. But this one down here in Shanghai, right here, could be the one that becomes the next big colossal stock exchange. Because there's been more billionaires made in China in the last decade than any other country. Europe, of course, started it all. It all started here in Western Europe, spread to the Americas, and now those same tools and technologies are been transferred to Asia. And so it's a worldwide market. If you want to invest, you can invest in Asian markets. I have some shares in Asian markets, European markets, right? They're pretty solid. And I have most of my stuff here. So it's, just up to you what you do. But I just wanted to show you that to let you know what these little voyages of Da Gama and Columbus meant over the next 500 years. A global supply chain that will allow us to defeat this pandemic. Without those supply chains being in place, we don't have a chance. But now we not only have a chance, but a really good chance to defeat this thing in the months ahead. It's not going to be easy, and it's going to probably go all summer. And my guess is we'll still be wearing masks next fall. But at least we've got a chance because we have a global supply chain of manufacturers, means to move these products, and means to get them to the last mile into people's arms. Okay, now let's talk about a couple of other things too. The lunar months, 29.53059 days. I think some of you got that right in your study guide. That's lunar months. Earth's rotation is 23 hours, 56 minutes, 4 seconds. Now, the thing is, the relationship between the Earth and the moon is what creates the tides. Now, tides are really important for ocean travel. Depending on the tides, you can go a certain place, you can't go others, okay? So that's important. Plus, if you're a surfer in California, you want to know when the tide is. The moon has a weird orbit around the Earth, and it pulls water toward it with gravity and then releases it when it goes somewhere else. And so that's what causes the tides to come up and down. In some places, the most extreme, tides can go up to 23 feet when it's at high tide. Normally it's not that much, but I know in California, surfers can't wait for the tides to get to about 8 feet. Man, that's the good surfing. And it could be at different times during the day. So they literally have tables, and we know all of the times, right? That tide is going to happen all over the world all at the same time because we've tracked all this. Now, let's get now to realistic. Because there's a moon, we have tides. But also because of the moon, we're maybe slowing down a bit in our spinning. The thing is, we're also maybe slowing down in relation to the sun. How much? Well, now we don't need chronometers. We now have atoms working for us. We have atomic clocks, and these are real new. These are since the 1970s. But the atomic clock now has shown that the modern day is longer by 1.7 milliseconds in a century. So every century we slow down about 1.7 milliseconds. You guys know as well as I do, we have to have leap years, right? And then every 4 years we have a leap year, except for when it's 100, and then we skip that in order to keep the clock, the calendar in line. Now we actually have leap seconds. And now and again, we add a leap second. All of this is, of course, the rotation of the Earth, and then we also have the factor of the moon coming around us and in relationship to the sun. So it's all very, very fun and interesting. Enjoy your astronomy class, because all this stuff is so interesting, and it impinges on our daily lives. 365.256 days to create an orbit. And who figured all this out? Well, it all started back here in ancient times. So now what we've kind of done is we've given you a little bit of a shot of prehistory, a little bit of a shot of ancient history, a little bit of shot of classical history, a little bit of medieval history, and now some modern history to show how it all links together. To give you an overview of each, now what we're going to do is we're going to dive back into the ancient past and come through it again, only in more detail. So let's kind of take a look at the prehistory. We didn't know a lot about prehistory until modern times. The truth of the matter is, prehistory was lost to us. There was no knowledge of it. We didn't know that there was, the first humanoids came out of Africa. There's no written documents that talk about that. The first man that came out of Africa didn't write it down on a tablet. Oh, hey, I was born today. And oh, by the way, I think I'm going to migrate to Europe. None of that. There's no written records. So we need another discipline that predates history. And that discipline is called archaeology. Archaeology was really created in about the 1750s to the mid 1800s. It was a new branch of science that said, there's some old stuff going on out here. Like, look at these rocks. I mean, how old are they? And oh, by the way, look, I've got bones. What kind of bones are they? Look like elephants. What are they? Mastodons. What are dinosaurs? Darwin, of course, was huge in this, and he was exploring in the early 1830s. But this right here is the archaeology. And archaeology starts with a thing called antiquarianism. It was kind of a philosophy where these antiquarians studying ancient artifacts, trying to figure out what they were, ancient manuscripts, that kind of stuff, going to historic sites. Now, who were these people? These were wealthy people who had made a bundle, a lot of Englishmen, a lot of Frenchmen, a lot of Europeans, and they had time on their hands because they're now wealthy and they could do other things. And so they started going around the world collecting artifacts like mummies and things like that and displaying them in their cabinets at home. Or they would have scientific centers in England and in France, and they would bring these in and discuss it. Antiquarianism focused on empirical evidence, proof, and encapsulated into this model by this guy, Richard Colt Hoare. Now, he said this: we speak from facts, not theory. We're going to look and see what's out there and start to define the ancient world, the world itself, geology. We're going to do this right. And a branch of all that is the systemization of archaeology. It's a science that really took root in the Enlightenment era, a period between the 17th and 18th centuries. Okay, so you now know what a century is, right? So late 1600s started, or middle of the 1700s, about the time the United States was being born. Jefferson would be a good example of one of these guys. I mean, he would be all in on this. He would love this. All right, now, so archaeology is Greek. So many of our terms come from ancient Greeks. The study of ancient peoples and cultures, that's what it means. And look, it's a modern term, but they used Greek terms to pull it together. Archaeology, study of ancient people. Well, how do you do archaeology? Well, you don't have written records, right, yet. So you do artifacts. You might find jewelry. You might find pots. You might find tools, weapons, artwork, anything like that gets buried in the ground. So how do we learn about the ancient world? How do we learn, the prehistoric world? Well, we find stone tools. How many of you have ever found an arrowhead or anything? You ever found an arrowhead? That's a Stone Age tool. I found a couple in my life. And it's pretty exciting when you find one that were made by Native Americans in our case here. And it's pretty fun. Well, then you're an archaeologist. I remember finding an ancient grinding stone and a pot that was made down in southern Utah by Native Americans that were cliff dwellers. Okay, so what is archaeology? Well, there are many types of it actually. And some study more human behavior and culture, and others do more what we call material analysis, where they actually dig in the ground and they scrape things and try to find stuff. Okay. Now, how do you know? A lot of times it's digging for stuff. And this is painstaking work. How do you know where to dig? Well, basically, you can study the land, and if you see something that just doesn't look right, you can go there. But modern times, we can actually use sound technology, and we can use satellite observation to find things. That's how they found that time calendar, that clock in Scotland. They were doing aerial photographs, and they looked down there, and then they said something's there. So they did these sound things, they boom, put the sounds and the vibrations, and they took pictures of those vibrations, and they said something's here, something's here, something's here, something's here. And so it takes a lot of science. It's a lot of fun. I don't know if you ever watched Jurassic Park, where they're actually out there doing a dig, and they're using the sound to get the images to know where to dig. All right, now, basically, let's skip this survey. When you do hit a site, you'll start with small test holes. You'll dig very carefully down, and then you'll find areas that all of a sudden hit pay dirt. For example, and I should have a picture of this, Jamestown Colony. Jamestown Colony was the first settlement in America by the British in 1607. Many people just assumed the entire place had been washed away by the sea, because the river runs right through it into the Chesapeake Bay. And so they thought it had been washed away by flood. But there was a naval firing range where the Navy was practice training, and people, of course, were there cleaning up after whatever, and they ran across these artifacts, and they run to the local university, William and Mary, and says, "We think we found something. What do you think this is?" And they're going, "Oh my goodness." They rushed to the site, and they found the actual Jamestown site. The evidence of where the post holes were in the fort were still there, and they have thousands and thousands and thousands of objects that they began to uncover. And so what they did was they did some test holes, and then they would basically start digging in sections, and they actually mark it off in squares, and you go down one square at a time, and you go down so deep, then another square, another square, another square, because you want to make sure you capture everything. And everything's precious, because you might find a little piece of a pot that will fit a bigger piece of a pot, and you can start putting those little pieces of pottery together. Or you can actually find dead people. Yes, a lot of people passed away there. They found their bodies, and then they did archaeological evidence on that, just like you would forensics, for a murder scene or whatever. And they went and examined these bodies and figured out what they were eating, what they were sick from, why they died. All of that stuff was done for something that happened in 1607. It's a fun field if you ever want to go into it. Here's a good example of squaring it off, taking it section by section, making sure you account for everything, and then of course when you're done, you fill it back up and try to make it look normal. Okay, so let's see. I'm going to skip all this. It's just a lot of green slides here. Some artifacts are more important than others. For example, if you're anywhere in Europe, finding Roman coins isn't that hard. And all the Roman coins are by emperors and periods of time. So you can know exactly when that coin was minted and who was the emperor or who was the gods they were worshiping at the time. So there's some that are really, really important. Anything to do with ceremonies like a chief or a leader become really, really important. But just everyday life, pottery, how they cooked food, how they buried their dead, how they worshiped, how they built their buildings and houses. Okay, so this is kind of what pulls it together. I mean, you can even, in some places, they found bodies that were frozen. Boy, those are very valuable. That might be 20,000 years old, and they've been stuck in the ice. We found this with mastodons. We found this in Siberia, where we found mastodons that are just fell into the ice, frozen, stayed there, and they've been there for all these years. And you can actually open up their stomachs to see what they were eating. That's pretty cool. So some sites are better than others. And I'm just going to skip now to the Chauvet Cave.
We're at a 3-minute warning.
Well, this is perfect because this is kind of where we wanted to end. Also, the ancient peoples were great artists. And everywhere they went, they drew things, often in caves. This is a cave in France that was it's near water. You can't see where the cave entrance is. Somebody found it, and they found this artwork. These are lions, right? That were drawn by ancient peoples some 32,000 to 30,000 years ago, BP. Look at the detail here. Look at the artistry. Look at the artwork. But it also tells you they were living with a lot of lions. There were a lot of lions rolling around. And there's other images that you see. And how many have ever seen hieroglyphs here in Utah where there's different places? Raise your hand if you've ever been to hieroglyphs and stuff. Isn't it cool? And we should fight to protect those because they all give us more insight about how people lived in the ancient world before history. And that's how we tell our prehistory. That's how we figure it out. All right, we're going to stop right there. I'm going to save this for the next class because that actually went pretty well. We hit our goal here. I wanted to get to that slide. And we'll catch you guys next time. And we'll move from the Stone Age into the first civilizations in the next lecture.